I'm Captain Marcus Goodmanson, Dean of Students at the Naval Postgraduate School, and I will be your moderator for today. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Naval Postgraduate School's Secretary of the Navy Guest Lecture Series, commonly referred to as the SGL. These guest lectures have been a featured part of the NPS student learning experience for decades. The SGL at NPS are normally held in King Hall, a picture of which you saw just a moment ago. We all have adapted to COVID-19 life, working and studying remotely, and today is our first ever virtual SGL. So thank you for joining us as we try something new. Our normal format offers guest speakers 20 to 30 minutes to give a presentation and the remaining time for questions and answers. I have a team of NPS students with me today who will each have a chance to ask a question, either a question of their own or a question from you during the event. If you do send us a question, please include your name, rank, and your current command. I will now hand it over to retired Vice Admiral Ann Rondeau, the President of the Naval Postgraduate School, to introduce our guest speaker for today. President Rondeau.
Thank you, Captain Goodmanson, and I also welcome everyone from the NPS community, as well as faculty, students, and staff from the Naval Education Enterprise able to join us today, the Naval Academy, Naval War College, Marine Corps University, and the United States Naval Community College. We are very pleased and honored to have with us today Admiral Michael Mullen. You all read his bio, but there are some things that need to be emphasized. As a naval officer, he commanded 3 ships, including the guided missile cruiser USS Yorktown. He went on to command the George Washington Battle Group, and then ashore, his last major operational command was as Commander, NATO Joint Force Command Naples, and Commander, U.S. Naval Forces Europe, before he reached the pinnacle of a U.S. Navy officer's career, becoming the 28th Chief of Naval Operations in 2005. In 2007, he was selected to be our country's 17th Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during a very challenging time then, too, where he led a transition in strategy, promoting new methods for countering terrorism, all of which culminated in the killing of Osama bin Laden. He has had 4 4-star commands. He continues to offer his guidance and counsel on geopolitical events, the environment, and national security interest and strategic leadership as the president of MGM Consulting, LLC, based in Annapolis. As a scholar, he graduated with distinction in 1968 from the United States Naval Academy. He's also a 1985 distinguished graduate of NPS, earning his master's here in operations research. And he is an elected member of the National Academy of Engineers. He has been a teacher at Princeton for several years and now teaches at the Naval Academy. Admiral Mullen is a champion of NPS and a champion of higher education at all levels of the Department of the Navy and of the country, especially known through his great work on the Education for Sea Power study published in 2018, which gave rise to many education initiatives and new funding support for important changes in naval education. Thank you, Admiral, for being with us today. The title of your talk sounds fascinating and, of course, relevant. The New Reality, Leadership in National Security in the Post-COVID-19 World. It is certainly one that requires us to think differently about many things, and we look forward to hearing your insights and engaging in questions with you. Admiral, sir, over to you.
Thank you, Ann. It's good to be with you. Thanks for what you're doing there and leading that great institution, and all of your involvement and engagement in the Navy's, the Naval Education Enterprise. You're a key critical person at exactly the right time. I actually chose the title of today in a way to obviously focus on what's currently going on, and specifically to talk about leadership. Ann mentioned that I taught up at Princeton. I actually taught at the Wilson School, and it was mostly international relations. Now, for the last semester, I was able to teach firsties, seniors at the Naval Academy, leadership, which is my passion. So today I'll talk a little bit about leadership at each level, whether it's the national level, the institutional level, or leadership for you specifically. And what I'll try to do is give you a framework that allows you and institutions and to think about how our country might figure out how we move forward in these incredibly difficult times. Yeah. I will say that at this point in my journey, which is obviously on the final 9 holes, as some say, coming along, one of the things that I treasure the most at this point and focus on is my faith, my family, and my friends. And as individuals, I would just hope that in your life and in your journey that you never do anything to jeopardize those, because at this point in my life, they're the most important part of who I am. So we live now in a tremendous time of great uncertainty and even greater ambiguity. And I believe we're not going back. We're facing and will face a completely new and in many ways unknown reality. Very little to nothing will be the same in the future. It makes me think to some degree the day the plane flew into the Pentagon and I was walking after I left the Pentagon, exited the Pentagon in the emergency, and I was literally walking across town to the Navy Yard and thinking the world had changed forever. And it seemed to in an instant on 9/11. Thus, too, it has changed with COVID-19. It may not have been an instant, but in its own way, it's much more devastating and I think much more significant. So what does that mean for and about leadership? History has shown, and my own perspective, having been through 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that you need different leaders for different times. Peace and war and now. So leaders that were coming along up to this point won't necessarily be the leaders that lead us in the future. And I've seen that up close and personal in war and peace, and I fundamentally believe that now. Some characteristics of what we'll need for leaders in the future is a level of boldness that oftentimes we don't see. Leaders with big ideas, leaders who are thinkers, broad, deep thinkers, innovators, change agents, and ethical leaders. Some of the characteristics that I think we'll need for the future. One might ask, how did we get here? I watched the erosion of the political landscape in Washington over the last 20 plus years. But it's also the fact that real wages in our country haven't grown in any significant way since the 70s, save some in the last couple of years. And in that regard, the American dream has evaporated. I have a good friend of mine who graduated a couple of years after I did from Annapolis, and who has had in the last 20 or 30 years significant health problems, and heart, kidney, those kinds of things. And when this crisis occurred, he had to go into the hospital. And he, quite frankly, was not ready to go into the hospital, obviously, during this emergency. I mean, he just hadn't taken good care of himself, hadn't prepared himself. And if I were to just take that one example and expand it to our healthcare system certainly wasn't prepared for this crisis. Some of you may know that when asked in 2010 what the biggest threat to the United States was, I opined at that point it was our federal debt. That surprised a lot of people. Just to remind, the debt back then was about 10 trillion. Before COVID hit, it was up to 23 trillion with no end in sight, and we've written another $5 or $6 trillion worth of checks here in this crisis. I have no idea, I'm still focused on this, I have no idea how we're going to resolve that long term as the debt continues to spiral out of control. And needless to say, as COVID hit, it lands right in the middle of this most divisive time in my lifetime politically, with the results being that it gets handled, not surprisingly, it gets handled by those divisive politics. When I talk about subjects or kind of look to the future, I try to focus on assumptions. Maybe it's the military planner in me, but if you get your assumptions right, then just about everything else that follows will line up and be right as well. And obviously the opposite is true. So just to tick off a few assumptions, I laid out one earlier. I think everything's going to be different. I don't know what that means specifically. I just know it's all going to be different. And in this kind of chaos, if you will, I think first principles are really critical, and they really need to be brought to bear from the leadership perspective. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I think winning in the future is best achieved by developing what's between our two ears. That aspect of it, the thinking, the education, the development there, the challenging, the debate, that is hugely important. It really is, for America, it's our strategic advantage. And I would neck that down to that's our strategic advantage, quite frankly, in the military. And I would argue that for those that are able to do that and lead in that regard, it's a tremendous professional and strategic advantage for you individually. I think leaders will continue to be decisive and determinative in the outcomes of our future, national and institutional for sure. I also believe we as a country, we're at a tipping point. And there aren't many of those. I talked about our lack of preparation for COVID-19, and it is that lack of preparation has been profound. Some would argue it's almost third world-like, middling in that regard. And as a Vietnam veteran and having grown up in the Vietnam era and fought in that war, that's the scars on my back will exist from that time for my entire life. And one of the comparisons that you often hear is how many have recently died compared to Vietnam. And we lost 58,000 great Americans in Vietnam, and that was over a decade. We've lost almost 90,000 Americans in the blink of an eye in a couple of months, which is almost 25% of what we lost in World War II. It's a stunning, stunning development. Another assumption, and this is sort of gets back to first principles, values matter, whether it's national values, institutional values, or personal values. And what I mean by that, some of them are, well, they're well known to everybody that's listening to this, but it's accountability, it's integrity, it's human rights, it's courage, it's equality, it's ethical behavior, it's having a moral compass, it's discipline, freedom, democracy. Those are cornerstone for us as a country, as a military, as a Navy and Marine Corps, and as individuals. And I would argue that as we move ahead in this very confused space and very much unknown space, hewing to those values will be critical to generating the right kind of outcomes for us. Another assumption is somehow we always end up fighting the last fight. No matter how many times people say it, no matter how many times we do it, we can't do that right now. We're in a brand new fight, not just the gray zone fights, but we're now in a fight for, I think, the long-term health and survival of the country. And when I say we, I'm talking about the American people. I'm not just talking about those of us who wear the uniform. So I would keep that in mind, and then I would tie that back to what I call bold and courageous decisions to make sure that we're not fighting the last fight. Assumptions: the future is dangerous, it's very uncertain, it's ambiguous, but it's also opportunistic. In every crisis, there are plenty of opportunities. And while we would much prefer not to be here, these are opportunities that we can't squander if we're going to get it right for the future. And in that regard, and another assumption is we must take significant risk. We must take significant risk. It needs to be calculated. It needs to be well thought through. It needs to be analyzed as best we can, particularly with modern tools. And yet it must be taken if we're going to succeed. In this world, as was true in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, actually in a way in every war, where we are right now, speed is absolutely critical and decisive. Execution is also critical and decisive. And again, I'm in assumptions. I'll leave you just one word, one country, and that's China. I've said for the better part of the last 10 years, I think the most important relationship on the planet is going to be that between the United States and China. That is now in bright lights as far as I'm concerned. Notionally, that's tied to the size of the two economies and the impact that the economies have, and I still believe that. But I think when we get downstream of COVID to some degree, that there's going to be a significant challenge between the United States and China. I can tell you back here in Washington, there are dozens and dozens of pieces of legislation, anti-China pieces of legislation floating around on both sides of the aisle on Capitol Hill. Another assumption I've learned as I've gotten older is to try to understand the impact of these events on our children. I've likened it, and the Vietnam experience is the one that I am personally experienced, but that war essentially will leave its footprints for about 100 years. When you think about what's happened in the last 100 years, those who went through the Depression and fought in World War II and built this country. And it wasn't just that they built it in a way where it became the greatest country in the world. And they built it in a way that was based on the lessons they learned when they were kids, as they watched their parents go through that Depression and during the time of World War II. I've spoken a couple times about Vietnam and the impact that that has had. And I've certainly seen that at the highest levels of government when we're talking about using the military, using military force. The 9/11 tragedy and the bin Laden kill, I can still remember walking back from the White House the night we killed bin Laden and hearing these young college voices in Lafayette Square singing the praises of the United States of America. And I was thinking that they were probably 8, 9, and 10 years old when 9/11 occurred. And yet that killing of him was a hugely impactful event. And that same generation went through the Great Recession in 08, 09, and I've spoken with many of them who want to be sure they are secure so that they don't have to go see their families. They saw their families go through it, and so that they don't have to go through it themselves. And now we have, excuse me, we have COVID-19, which has wiped out the economy. I talked to one of my former students today who's in his mid-20s at Princeton, who's in his mid-20s, and one of his concerns is the ability to actually provide for his family over the course of his life because of the impact that has occurred on the economy. I'm still on assumptions. First principles. We need to lead with our values, and those things won't change. We need to lead with our values at every opportunity. We need to read and study good leaders of those times when the country was in this kind of crisis before. Emulate their best qualities and push yourself to grow from a leadership perspective. We've had great leaders historically in very difficult times, and those who led in those times can provide us, I think, great lessons. When I talk to young people about leadership, I'm always anxious to have them think through, what do they believe in? What are their beliefs? And we don't take much time to reflect, step back, and ponder, who am I and what do I really believe, much less write down those beliefs. And I would encourage you to do that because those beliefs will drive you in just about everything that you do. And for me, and I'll just give you an example, I'll share some of mine. I believe in education. I think our education system's under siege in the country, excuse me, K through 12. And if we don't fix that long term, we're not going to be able to compete, much less at the higher level of education and at the level that you're at right now. But I believe in education, and I think we really need to press that now, almost more than any time over the course of my adult life. I believe in diversity because I think diversity gets you to a place where you make better decisions. You are taking a more diverse set of inputs, which allows leaders to generate better outcomes. I'm a strong believer in civilian control of the military. We should never, ever do anything but have that belief, those of us who wear the uniform. And at the same time, I'm very much a believer in an apolitical military. I think, particularly from the retired side, we've taught our young ones like you that it's okay to criticize policy and individuals after we take the uniform off, and that confuses the American people. I believe strongly in that. And if we get politicized as a military, then we're not the military that the United States of America deserves, and we're not a part of the democratic principles that are so critical to us as a country. I trust the American people. I always have. I believe in national service. I believe in globalization, and that may be a nasty word these days. I don't think there's any way around it. Again, it's the interweaving of the economies. And I think the more we isolate as a country, the more we're inviting enemies to take advantage of that, and the sooner path to a devastating outcome for us, potentially in conflict as a country. You can see China seizing opportunity after opportunity globally now. Just today's stories on the WHO is one example, and it's not the first. I believe that change is constant. If you're going to be a leader of the future, you've got to be able to lead change, which is uncomfortable and exciting, and as I said, it's constant. Professional competence matters, and every single person that's listening to this, whatever your area of expertise, make it the best you can possibly make it. I also believe in balance, both personally and professionally. I talked about taking risk, calculated risk. We need to take it, and I believe in that. I believe in our chain of command. And I believe that if you or anyone disagrees with who we are as a military or who we are as a country or what we're doing and we're wearing the uniform, that the proper step is resignation, and that becomes your statement for the record. I'm a big believer in the Fourth Estate. I think it's absolutely vital. It's under fire, as are many institutions are under great criticism and fire right now, our intelligence community, the State Department, the FBI, et cetera. And I believe in those institutions, and I believe in the people who are critical to them, and that they provide absolute bedrock support for who we are as a country. None of them are perfect, nor are we in DoD either. I believe the post-Cold War environment will continue to unravel. It has been since 1989, more so than I think we really realized how much it would. And I believe we've militarized our foreign policy far too much. We need to empower the other agencies, state, USAID, Treasury, all those agencies that are involved across the board in terms of our foreign policy, and that close to the last resort ought to be the use of the military. And I think the opposite has happened, is we've defanged so many of those institutions. Oftentimes the only answer becomes a military one. Those of you that know me know I'm a big believer in jointness and in the interagency. And there's great irony here too, when you think about the countries, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Boy, they've been around a long time. And I think they're going to be around a long time in opposition to what we're doing. How they do it, how they're led, how they impact, how they act on the world stage, that could be changing in some cases, but they believe in things that we do not believe and stand for. And so I think keeping focus on them in this time frame will also be absolutely critical. I've said historically, and just wrapping this up, I would like leaders to listen, to learn, and to lead. Leaders need to study, they need to grow, they need to challenge the assumptions, they need to be educated, and they need to educate. And more than anything else, I believe we do all this through great talent, great people, and focusing on them. I've had a privilege of teaching midshipmen at the Naval Academy. 2 weeks ago, I spent an hour and a half with the current group of White House fellows who are probably in their early to mid 30s with extraordinary backgrounds, and now to speak to you. And I have great hope for the country, and I have great hope for our military. But it isn't going to be easy. It's going to be incredibly challenging. And particularly in the kind of dramatically changed environment that we find ourselves right now in with COVID. So you also need to take care of yourself, take care of your family, and take care of each other as we move into this completely new era of national security across the board. Thanks for what you're doing, and thanks for listening.
Admiral, thank you very much. That was just terrific. I want to be sure that we get to questions and answers, but you mentioned a number of things over the years. You and I have had many opportunities to discuss a crisis in opportunities, taking significant risk, the assumptions and first principles, and profoundly what it is to understand that we believe in, and then challenging us. But most importantly, speaking about our cognitive agility as a country and as leaders. So I'm going through my notes and being reminded that you are a man who is consistent in what you do believe. So thank you for that very much. Captain Goodmanson, I'm going to turn this over to you for now time with our Q's and A's. Over to you.
Thank you, President Rondeau. We have a great team of 7 student volunteers with diverse backgrounds, careers, and curricula. Each will ask a question of Admiral Mullen and will continue in rotation for as long as we have time. First up will be the president of our President's Board for Student Affairs, Lieutenant Junior Grade Brian Pajarillo, who helped us put this event together. Brian is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. He's currently studying manpower systems analysis at the Naval Postgraduate School. Brian, what's your question for Admiral Mullen?
Good afternoon, sir, and thank you for your time.
Hi, Brian.
You had mentioned our relationship with China, who continues their series of microaggressions in the South China Sea. What advice do you have for our sailors, specifically in PAC Fleet, in maintaining resiliency and maintaining their focus on the mission despite the impacts on health, manning, and readiness?
Well, I think one of the things, obviously, that has been brought to bear in the COVID-19 era, very specifically and very visibly, has been the Theodore Roosevelt and the health crisis that we have on a major fleet asset like that. I do take some comfort, and I actually believe that one of the things the CO said, that if he had to get her underway, he could do that. And so she certainly could respond if the crisis level got to a point where she needed to. And obviously, you do that probably at increased risk to the overall health of those who are on her. But this is a demanding challenge, not just for the Roosevelt. It's a demanding challenge for any ship anywhere. I know that the Navy and actually all the services have taken extraordinary steps to try to make sure that the impact of COVID-19 is actually minimized. And while obviously, particularly on TR, I think we've had one tragic death. I think it was a chief. By and large so far, and there's a lot we don't know about this virus, which is one of the scary parts. But by and large, it seems as though the younger group does pretty well by one way, either by not contracting it or getting through it pretty well. And I'm fond of reminding everybody that the average age of any unit in the United States military is 21 years old. There are those who obviously skew that, so I certainly recognize there are others that would be more vulnerable. And then to be specific about, we will need to continue to address the challenges in the South China Sea and in the region. We've got allies and friends out there that have that have great expectations. It is the center of 4 of the 5. That part of the world is the center of gravity for 4 of the 5 biggest economies in the world. Stability out there, which we've had and been a part of for a long time, has generated an improved way of life for millions and millions and millions of people globally, particularly in that region. So our commitment there, I think we need to be steadfast with. I think the Chinese will continue to challenge us. We need to be realistic in a sense that they really think they own the South China Sea. That 9-dash line is something that they drew, I think it was 1947, and they still believe, despite international law, that they own it. And we need to be there with our allies and make sure that they know that that actually is not a legal reading of international law. And I think there's opportunity there as well with the Chinese who want to play on the world stage, but they're going to have to follow the rules at some point as well. So it's a vitally important part of the world. I think, as I talked about the U.S.-China relationship for this century, I think that region, the Western Pacific, Indo-Pacific, if you will, is the most critical part of the world for this upcoming century. And from a standpoint of all of our resources, not just the military, we need to focus on that to ensure that it stays stable.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, next up is Major Evan Zach Ota. Zach graduated from the University of Hawaii, is currently in the National Security Affairs program pursuing a Master of Arts degree in Southeast Asia Security Studies. Major Ota has served as a rifle platoon commander in Fallujah, Iraq, a company commander in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, and as a battalion operations officer in the Indo-Pacific Command Area of Responsibility. Major Ota's next assignment will be as a Southeast Asia desk officer at U.S. Marine Corps Forces Pacific. Major, what's your question?
Good afternoon, Admiral.
Good afternoon.
I actually have two questions of my own I'd like to ask you. Your official biography on the Joint Chiefs of Staff website describes you as an active military diplomat and statesman who encouraged improved military-to-military relations throughout the world. So I have two related questions. First, what was the most important military relationship you built during your chairmanship? And second, how can we as future military diplomats improve relations with foreign militaries in the new security area that you just described?
The answer to the first, it's hard to say, one in particular. Clearly, because we were at war in Iraq and Afghanistan, I spent a tremendous amount of time in that part of the world. And those that know my background know how much time I spent in Pakistan. And quite frankly, that was tied to our Vietnam experience, where you literally couldn't win in Vietnam because you had the safe havens in Laos and Cambodia, and effectively the Taliban and other terrorists, Al-Qaeda, et cetera, had a safe haven in Pakistan. And so we weren't going to win it in Afghanistan unless we had support from Pakistan. And that's an enormously complex part of the world. So I spent a fair amount of my time, significant amount of my time with the head of the Pakistani army, who was effectively the most senior and powerful military individual in Pakistan. Probably, and this was a little bit unexpected, probably the most important was with my Russian counterpart. And that wasn't just because of me, because I have a tendency to reach out, but he was willing to have a conversation, and he actually had permission from his boss, President Putin, to have the conversations. And I actually met him on the phone over a weekend when they invaded Georgia in 2008. And my line of communication was the only line of communication open with Russia. The presidents weren't talking, the Secretary of State and foreign minister weren't talking, the national security advisors weren't talking. So over the course of that weekend, 7 conversations, and at the end of each conversation, I didn't know him at all. He'd been in the job a month and he was at war. He'd been out of headquarters for 20 plus years. So I know he was trying to figure a lot of stuff out. But at the end of each conversation, he said to me in his own words, basically, he'd like to continue to talk. And so we actually met afterwards in Helsinki to talk about mutually agreeable and disagreeable issues, if you will. There were things that we could work on. Terrorism was one, cyber was another. He was actually very instrumental in making sure that the northern border in Afghanistan stayed open for the time I was there. And then fast forward 2 years from that point in time, I ended up negotiating New START with him, much to my surprise, that we ended up in that nuclear treaty, spending a lot of time negotiating. So that was probably as important, and particularly when you consider those strategic weapons, that was probably the most important engagement. But I had many, including, took me a long time, but I finally got to China. Same kind of thing, same approach. And I would argue for young officers to do that, you're going to be in a position to do this in your upcoming job, establishing those relationships early. You've got young officers from a bunch of countries that are NPS right now. I would assume those countries don't send any slouches to school. And oftentimes, those individuals end up in significant positions in their own military, in their own country. And that relationship which you establish when you're, at this point, can be hugely impactful down the road. Same is true at the War College in Newport, and it actually happens in all the services. So I'm just somebody that believes if I'm in a crisis, I don't want the first call that I'm making to whoever this leader might be to be the one that is in the middle of that crisis. Somebody I don't know. Now, I didn't have any choice with the Russian Chad, but I actually had engaged his predecessor as well, so I was somewhat known to the Russians at the time. But those are two good examples of engagement, and I wasn't the only one that did that. I've always felt that it's absolutely critical, particularly when the politicals are not talking.
Thank you very much, Admiral.
Sir, next is Lieutenant Seamus Fish, Naval Special Warfare, who graduated recently with a Master of Science in Defense Analysis. Lieutenant Fish is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and was the captain of the Navy lightweight rowing team. Lieutenant Fish is a SEAL whose operational assignments include squad commander at SEAL Team 2 and deployment spanning 3 continents in support of contingency and named operations. Lieutenant Fish, what's your question today?
Good afternoon, Admiral.
Hi,
my question is from Alex Guffey, who's a civilian here at NPS. Alex asks, your experience as CNO and chairman of the Joint Chiefs was spent fighting terrorism. This fight is arguably against a borderless enemy. What, from your understanding of how to fight terrorism, do you think should be applied to leadership necessary to defeat COVID-19, a truly borderless threat? Advice for military leaders and advice for civic and business leaders as well.
Well, one of the main lessons I learned in the terrorism fight, and I mentioned it in terms of critical beliefs, is speed, and that in a fight like this, in a crisis like this, and this is my experience, not just in the wars, not just against terrorism, but early, bold decisions make a huge difference. And we're still early in this crisis, as tragic as it is. And they almost get characterized by being seen as far too forward-leaning or far too much overreach at the time of the crisis that it occurs, and then in reflection afterwards, they're oftentimes looked back as gee, I wish they'd gone farther at the time. So overall speed, how fast we get at it. Obviously, I mean, this is in retrospect. How do we react to intelligence early enough to get something right, to make sure it gets to decision makers to head it off? If you just look at the death rate in South Korea versus what we have here, I mean, it's extraordinary. Now, South Korea, all those Westpac countries, they were burned pretty bad with SARS, and so they actually took those lessons, whether it was Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, et cetera, and they were readier for this than we were. So bold decisions, bold early decisions, even now in this crisis. Your point, I think we really need to think through what's the best way to get at something like this, because it is borderless. I mean, I have this model in my head, or this visual in my head, as it's in every nook and cranny. It just flows naturally to absolutely everything. Every person or every institution or entity that I speak to, they talk to me about different impacts of COVID on them. And it's going to be different impacts in terms of how do we get out of this? And yet it is important that we work this together as much as possible. And I think to the degree we're divided, the longer it's going to last. That's why I worry about this thing landing in the middle of this political division, which is now signature for our country. We're not the only country. And I'm not surprised at all that essentially it's being handled as another political issue when so many lives are being needlessly lost because of that, because of certain things that we won't do. So President Rondeau and I were talking just before we went on, and it's a very interesting case study on federalism, states' rights, all those kinds of things. But for me, that's all interesting in the aftermath. What I want to do is save lives. And back, one of the reasons I talk about not fighting the last battle, we'll get ahead of this at one point at great cost, though I think by all I can put together, it's probably next year before we have a vaccine. And that we make sure that in preparing for the next pandemic, we're not just focused on this. And it's a much bigger picture than obviously those of us in the military, those of us in government. We need a healthcare system that can handle this thing. And this one, our healthcare system, which is middling at best, before going into this, hasn't done very well, despite the heroics of so many doctors, nurses, healthcare workers, and all the people that support them. I worry a great deal, quite frankly, about them. We've been through a lot in the military in terms of the war fighting and the post-traumatic stress that comes with that. I think we're going to have a boom, if you will, of post-traumatic stress in the healthcare world, because they are being asked to give their lives. They're trying to protect their families at home. Many have died. And while they're technically prepared from a standpoint of a skill set, they weren't mentally prepared to have to run into this fire thinking they may not come out. Very few of them anyway. So there's a lot to learn. We need to learn as we go to get ahead of this. But I think speed, bold decisions, and then the other piece which is true in anything, but the other piece that I meant is execution. Don't just give me the vision. Somebody get on the ground and tell me that what's happening on the ground, what's being executed, is actually what I want to have happen as a leader. And leaders need that feedback.
Thank you, Admiral.
Yeah.
So our next is Special Agent First Lieutenant Daniela Carchedi, Air Force student. First Lieutenant Carchedi is a graduate of George Washington University, ROTC. She's currently completing her Master in Regional Security Studies in Sub-Saharan Africa in the National Security Affairs Program. First Lieutenant Carchedi is a special agent in the Air Force. She conducts criminal and counterintelligence investigations. Her next assignment will be at Ramstein Air Force Base as Ops Officer for AFRICOM Counterintelligence with the 25th Expeditionary Field Investigation Squadron. Lieutenant Carchedi, what's your question?
Good afternoon, Admiral. Thank you for being here. I actually have an AFRICOM-related question for you, sir.
Sure.
During your tenure as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, U.S. AFRICOM was established, increasing the physical presence and cooperation in the region. Last year, Defense Secretary Mark Esper announced that the military will draw down in AFRICOM to pivot toward other priority locations. Meanwhile, as you had mentioned, great power competitors and terrorist groups are expanding their activity in the area of responsibility, conflicting with their national defense strategy and our foreign policy toward Africa. How does the U.S. effectively mitigate these threats with a reduced workforce in a post-COVID world where physical presence and contact is even more limited but important to accomplishing these goals?
Well, I assume the secretary meant less deployed forces as opposed to AFRICOM sort of pulling out, meaning AFRICOM not being engaged. I think, and it depends on the mission of the force, if you will. But I'm somebody that's believed for a long time you got to have boots, you got to have people there to engage. And having gone through all of what we did to stand up AFRICOM, and fundamentally we did it. And as I think, as Admiral Rondeau said, I was in Naples, and part of my responsibility there was were all the countries in Africa. In Africa, this was before AFRICOM, but in Europe and Africa, and quite frankly, I think it was 91 countries. It was just too big. I mean, there's no way Brussels could handle Africa per se. So we were given it lip service, and I think Africa is an incredibly critical continent for lots of reasons. They've got wonderful people, great resources, and very, very bright future. On the one hand, they also have, they have tremendous challenges economically, tremendous challenges from a healthcare standpoint, et cetera. And having lived in Europe in 2004, I saw up close and personal the fear that Europeans had for all of the migrants that were coming out of Africa, and that continues. I've also believed for some time that whatever comes from Africa has a way of getting into Europe, taking a left turn, and ending up here in the United States. And I've seen that happen, particularly the bad stuff, the weapons, the drugs, the kidnapping, if you will, those kinds of things. So I think we ignore Africa at our peril. I will say there's something about the United States that we tend to be an east-west oriented country. I've seen that my whole life. Obviously, the Cold War did a lot of that. We continue to be that way. we don't just ignore Africa in many ways, although I thought AFRICOM was a great step forward. We do the same thing in Latin America. We don't spend enough time with our like-minded brothers and sisters, if you will, in Latin America, whose values are oftentimes the same, whose interests are the same. And it's baffled me for a long time. Why do we don't align better from a hemispheric standpoint, from an economic standpoint, and from a national security perspective? There are some answers to that. We had some pretty bad times down there in the 70s with what the U.S. did, so they're a little sensitive to our showing up. But I think there's great opportunity. That the challenge in Africa, as an example, is all these other things, and so Secretary said it basically, other priorities don't allow us to engage as much as we should on continents like that, Africa being one. We can't ignore, I mean, as much as someone would like to, we can't ignore Libya. There are just too many terrorists there now. We can't ignore the other we can't ignore, Boko, and you can't ignore what's going on over in Somalia. I mean, it just because it comes back to bite us very significantly. So how do you balance that? And one of the ways you can balance that is with allies. And if we have allies that are willing to do some of that when we can't, but we're also selling out a lot of our allies in the last several years. And so they're wondering whether we will be for them in the future as we have in the past. So it's a great question. It's very complicated. And I suspect you'll have your hands full when you get to your next job.
I'm sure. Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Sir Lieutenant Ross Spinelli also recently graduated from NPS in March from the Operations Research Department. Born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Lieutenant Spinelli graduated from Rochester Institute of Technology, ROTC. Ross is a submarine officer, and his next assignment will be attending the Submarine Officer Advanced Course prior to reporting to his next boat as a department head. Lieutenant Spinelli, what's your question?
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Sir, my question comes from a person at the U.S. Naval War College, Mike Stamot. His question, we already talked a little bit about it, deals with China-U.S. relationships. The question is, what areas of cooperation might the United States pursue with China to foster global stability and prosperity?
Well, my hope has been, and I'm reminded whenever I say that, hope's really critical, but hope is not a strategy or a plan. I understand that. But for a long time, I had hoped that the leaders could figure out, because we're so dependent on each other because of the economies, to figure out how to make that work together constructively. We seem to be, and I would argue we've given China far too much runway, and they've taken advantage of it. And so what I think President Trump has done and the administration was say enough is enough. And he was in that regard, he's absolutely right. We gave Hu Jintao and we gave Xi Jinping far too much runway. If these two economies can't be made to work together, I'm not optimistic at all. I'm very concerned about instability in that part of the world. The biggest challenge China has is internal in terms of its own stability, if you will, or unrest. I was amazed several years ago now, on a trip actually that I went, and I was talking to Chinese political leaders, some of them, and they talked about having to deal with the Chinese people in the digital world. And I kind of frowned and I said, are you kidding me? Can't you control all that? And I think the number back then is the response was they had 160 million bloggers. That's a lot of bloggers. I get out of 1 billion people, but they are dealing with that all the time. And to push hard, quite frankly, on them in a way that threatens that internal stability from a strategic perspective, from our perspective, is something that concerns them greatly. You've probably seen Graham Allison's or heard of Graham Allison's book, which talks about the Thucydides trap, that when you have a rising power, you have a global power, one in decline and one rising. I think there are 16 case studies in there, and 12 out of the 16 they've gotten in conflict. That is instructive, and as far as I'm concerned, should be instruction for us to not let that happen. Any kind of world war with China would be an absolute nightmare for the world. So I'm more concerned than I've been. A lot of this is, how is China going to react? There's going to be some significant backlash against China as a result of COVID. Yet we've got to figure out, there's only one planet, it's only so big, and we're going to have to figure out how to live together and not destroy the planet in so doing. So the question's a great question. There are no easy answers. There are people that have spent a lifetime on this and are much smarter than I, who can't figure out how to exactly get this right. So I think leaders need, back, maybe what I said earlier, is the engagement between leaders is really important. So, President Trump and President Xi's relationship is critical, as was Obama's and Xi's, and Obama and Hu Jintao, et cetera. Flowing down from there, if they are guiding this in a supportive way, there are positive possibilities. If it doesn't, if we don't have that, then I think the negative side is going to have its head above the horizon for a significant time in the future, and that's not good for any of us.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, I know time is getting tight, but we have 2 more questions from students, if you've got the time.
I do.
Next is Commander Sean Dougherty, who is currently in the Systems Engineering Analysis curriculum. Sean is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. As a naval aviator, Commander Dougherty's previous assignments include HSC-23, the FRS HSC-3 Merlins, and a shooter on the USS Carl Vinson. Upon graduation, he will report to NAS Corpus Christi as the executive officer for the VT-28 Rangers. Commander Dougherty, your question.
Good afternoon, Admiral. My question comes from Lieutenant Commander David Barnhill, who's an NPS student here. And the question is, as a former operations research student and more broadly as a Naval Postgraduate School graduate, how did you apply what you learned from your studies throughout the course of your career?
So I actually came to NPS late, against the advice of my detailer, who told me it was a terminal assignment. It was a good friend of mine, actually, but that I had no future if I went there. But if I could find a seat in the OR curriculum, which is what I wanted to do, he'd send me. So he did. I was also coming from overseas. We'd lived in the Philippines. I had some family priorities, 2 young kids, our families both in Los Angeles. So I really wanted to go to Monterey. And then the OR piece was, I call it, there are OR aficionados that would hate this, but it really it is applied math, and it is something, and I was decent in math and engineering, but decent in math, and so it's something I really enjoyed. And probably more than anything else, studying at that level. I'd been in the Navy 15 years at that point. So that's probably close to where you are. I mean, literally. And what it gave me were tools to frame problems. It gave me ways to analyze problems. It gave me the foundational stuff in data analysis, for example. It gave me the opportunity to understand the difference between linear and nonlinear, et cetera. Those kinds of things, and that there were ways to study and determine in limited, in a limited environment, good solutions. So more than anything else, though, it taught me how to frame problems. It also taught me, I was at the right level. I also learned there that there was not a single subject that I wanted to know enough about to get a PhD at the time. But it's a great institution. Incredibly dedicated faculty. Back then and to this day, that is relevant to the services and what we do for a living. And needless to say, it's in Monterey. Enough said about that. It's a nice place to be with my family. So it provided a tremendous boost to me in lots of ways, many of which I didn't understand at the time. But I ended up using it almost unconsciously in many of the things that I did down the road.
Thank you, sir.
Particularly when that road didn't have any future, as my detailer said.
Sir, this is the final question we have for you today. It comes from Lieutenant Matt Seawright. He's enrolled in the Combat Systems Science and Engineering program. Matt's a native of Slidell, Louisiana. Originally enlisting as an Aegis Fire Controlman in 2008, he applied to the U.S. Naval Academy and graduated in 2015. His operational assignments include USS Sentry in Manama, Bahrain, and USS Chung Hoon. He's been selected as an integrated air and missile defense weapons and tactics instructor and looks forward to his next department head tour afloat. Lieutenant Seawright, our final question, please.
Good afternoon, Admiral.
Hi, Matt.
Hey, sir. So we'll kind of finish as we began here. And my question concerns China's Belt and Road Initiative. During my short career so far, I've had the opportunity to see China's presence grow firsthand in locations such as the Kingdom of Bahrain and Djibouti as a result of the state-subsidized economic program. Given your experience within the Department of Defense, how do you think this affects our relations with these countries and military operations in the area? And if you wish to comment on any other regions you feel have been more strongly affected, please do.
Well, they are principally, historically, they've principally been a regional power. They've grown to be a regional power. But one of the things that I've watched the Chinese do, and I can't prove this, but they are following in our footsteps. So they're developing a blue water navy. I actually years ago, on my visit to China, went to sea on one of their frigates, and they were okay, but they were good enough to let me understand, to let me take away from that it would take some time, but eventually they would really become, an outstanding blue water navy. Same kind of decision when they make a decision to buy that aircraft carrier, which is not much of a warfighting machine, certainly compared to us, but at the same time, it sends a big signal, and certainly in the region. So then they've started to deploy, and they have for the last dozen or so years, principally initially up in the Gulf of Oman, the anti-pirate thing. But again, they sort of did that very carefully. But they have built out a place in Djibouti. They obviously have spent, hundreds of millions of dollars in lots of places all over the country to get businesses started, if you will. What I don't have a good handle on is how good they're in an execution and follow-up. So specifically about the Belt and Road, while it may be a threatening concept, is it more than a concept? Have they actually executed in a way? I know many of their initial engagements economically in countries around the world, they were seen and held in they were held very bitterly by the locals because they brought all Chinese labor, they'd build it, and then they'd leave. It was almost like strip mining, if you will, taking what they needed, and then they took off. So there's a lot to learn. There's certainly some potential there. I'm not as concerned about Belt and Road as others are because it's a huge undertaking. It costs a ton of money, and their resources aren't unlimited, even though they continue to devote a lot to that. So I think we'll see, where they go with that specifically. I think we need to address it and certainly watch it, but I don't. I'm old enough now to know there's no perfect answer to any of these kinds of things. One of the things that I guess I'd say to all of you young people, when we grew up in the Cold War with the Soviets, we treated the Soviets as if they were 10 feet tall. They weren't. The Chinese are not 10 feet tall. So they've got challenges internally, externally, economically, militarily, you name it. And I think we just need to be prudent about our engagement with them in terms of, again, providing stability, certainly in that part of the world, so that the economies can thrive.
Thank you, sir.
Admiral, thank you for taking a few extra minutes with us to answer our final questions. With that, I'd like to turn it back over to President Rondeau. Thank you again, sir, for your time.
Thanks.
Hey, Admiral, we really do thank you. This is our first virtual SGL, and cannot think of a better leader to talk to us and open up our aperture as to how we're thinking, so that as we continue these SGLs, we have an opportunity to really think about the broader issues. For our next virtual SGL, and Admiral, we invite you to tune in. It'll be on the 21st of July, and the topic will be 5G. And we're going to have two stellar speakers, General Keith Alexander, who was commander of U.S. Cybercom, and Vice Admiral Jan Tighe, who was the DCNO for Information Warfare and Director of Naval Intelligence. And both of these leaders are just continuing to lead. So we look forward to seeing everybody back on the 21st of July, and I want to thank the students and the audience for their great engagement and questions and answers. And sir, again, many thanks to you. We're over our time, but have a good day for everybody, and a safe, healthy, and secure week. Thank you very much, sir. Out here.